"Father, forgive them. They know not what they do." These were the final words of Wanda Jean Allen before she was executed in 2001, making history as the first black woman put to death in the US since 1954. Today we're looking at the youngest women sentenced to death row in the US. Some showed no remorse, others claimed innocence until the very end. From their brutal crimes to their last meals and final words, these are the women who face the ultimate punishment. 15th Virginia Christian. On March 18, 1912, 17-year-old Virginia Christian was convicted of the brutal murder of her employer, Ida Bellotti, in Hampton, Virginia. Christian, a black teenage maid, had been working for Bellotti, a white woman, when an argument escalated into violence. Christian struck Bellotti repeatedly, leaving her unconscious before suffocating her with a towel. The crime shocked the segregated South, and despite Christian's claims of self-defense, authorities quickly sought the harshest punishment possible. Christian was arrested, charged with murder, and swiftly put on trial. Her case was heard by an all-white jury, and within days she was convicted and sentenced to death. Efforts to appeal for clemency, including a plea from her mother to the governor, were ignored. Despite her young age, Virginia Christian became the first and only female juvenile to be executed in Virginia. On August 16, 1912, Virginia Christian was executed in the electric chair at the Virginia State Penitentiary. Witnesses described her as silent and composed in her final moments. The execution sparked outrage among civil rights groups who argued that racial bias played a significant role in her sentencing. Christian's last meal is not officially documented, but reports suggest she was given the standard prison meal. Her final words, reportedly spoken in a letter to her mother, were heartbreaking. "Mama, I wish I could see you before I die, but they tell me I can't. I am not scared to die, but I do not want to leave you." Virginia Christian's case remains one of the most controversial executions of a teenage girl in American history. But while her crime was fueled by rage, our next case involves a mother who committed the unthinkable, not against a stranger, but against her own children. 14. Christina Marie Riggs. On November 4, 1997, 26-year-old Christina Marie Riggs committed an unthinkable crime. She murdered her own children. A struggling nurse in Arkansas, Riggs was battling depression and financial hardships when she decided to end both her life and the lives of her children. She gave her 5-year-old son, Justin, and 2-year-old daughter, Shelby, lethal doses of potassium chloride, a drug used in executions. When that failed to kill them, she smothered both children with a pillow. Riggs then attempted to take her own life with a drug overdose, but she survived and was arrested. Riggs confessed to the murders and showed little emotion during her trial. She was convicted of capital murder in 1998 and sentenced to death. Despite appeals that argued her severe depression played a role in the killings, the court upheld her execution. She later rejected any further legal efforts to save her life, stating she was ready to die. On May 2, 2000, at the age of 28, Christina Riggs was executed by lethal injection at the Cummins unit in Arkansas. She became the first woman executed in the state since 1845. Witnesses described her demeanour as calm as she lay strapped to the gurney. Riggs requested a last meal of stuffed crust pizza, salad, and cherry-flavoured punch. Her final words were brief but remorseful. "There is no way words can express how sorry I am. I ask for your forgiveness. I hope my death brings you peace." Riggs' crime shocked the nation, but she accepted her fate without resistance. Our next case, however, involves a woman who maintained her innocence until the very end, even as the execution chamber doors closed. 13. Frances Newton. On April 7, 1987, 21-year-old Frances Newton committed a crime that stunned Houston, Texas. She murdered her husband, Adrian Newton, and their 2 young children, Alton, 7, and Farrah, 1, in cold blood. Investigators found all 3 victims shot to death in their apartment. The motive? Prosecutors argued Newton had recently taken out a $100,000 life insurance policy on her husband and planned to collect the payout. A gun, matching the murder weapon, was found in an abandoned house linked back to Newton. Newton was arrested and charged with triple homicide. Despite maintaining her innocence, she was convicted in 1988 and sentenced to death. Her case became one of the most controversial in Texas history, with supporters arguing that her trial was flawed and that the forensic evidence was questionable. Multiple appeals and requests for clemency were denied, and despite growing protests, the execution was set. On September 14, 2005, at the age of 40, Frances Newton was executed by lethal injection at the Huntsville unit in Texas. She was the first black woman executed in the state since the Civil War. Even as she lay strapped to the gurney, she continued to proclaim her innocence. Newton declined a special last meal and ate the standard prison dinner. Her final words reflected her lingering hope. "I just want to say I did not kill my husband or my children. I love you all, and I will see you again one day." Newton's case left behind a legacy of doubt, but our next case involves a woman whose guilt was never in question. She didn't just kill, she tortured her victim in one of the most horrifying cases ever seen in Texas. 12th, Lisa Ann Coleman. On July 26, 2004, 27-year-old Lisa Ann Coleman was arrested for one of the most horrific child abuse cases in Texas history. Coleman and her partner Marcella Williams systematically tortured and starved Williams' 9-year-old son, Devontae Williams, leading to his tragic death. When paramedics arrived, they found Devontae's emaciated body, weighing just 35 pounds, less than half the normal weight for his age. His body was covered in scars and injuries from prolonged physical abuse. Coleman was charged with capital murder, and prosecutors argued that Devontae's death was the result of deliberate and ongoing abuse. While Williams, the boy's mother, took a plea deal and received life in prison, Coleman went to trial and was sentenced to death in 2006. Her defense tried to argue that the boy's death was accidental, but the overwhelming evidence of abuse led to a swift conviction. On September 17, 2014, at the age of 38, Lisa Ann Coleman was executed by lethal injection at the Huntsville unit in Texas. Despite efforts from anti-death penalty activists to stop the execution, the sentence was carried out. Witnesses said she remained calm and even smiled at those in attendance. Coleman requested a last meal of fried chicken, mashed potatoes, green beans, and sweet tea. Her final words were simple but defiant. "I'm all right, tell my family I love them." Lisa Ann Coleman's case was one of Texas's most disturbing child murder trials, but our next case is even more shocking. It involves a pickaxe, a brutal double murder, and a killer who found religion on death row, but that wouldn't be enough to save her. Yedenin Toyster, Carla Faye Tucker. On June 13, 1983, 23-year-old Carla Faye Tucker and her boyfriend Daniel Garrett broke into a Houston apartment to steal motorcycles. Inside, they found Jerry Lynn Dean and Deborah Thornton. What was supposed to be a burglary turned into a gruesome murder. Armed with a pickaxe, Tucker repeatedly stabbed both victims, later admitting that she felt a thrill with each blow. Her crime shocked Texas as the sheer brutality of the killings showed no remorse or hesitation. Tucker was arrested and sentenced to death in 1984. While on death row, she underwent a dramatic transformation, converting to Christianity and becoming an outspoken advocate for prison reform. Many high-profile figures, including Pope John Paul II, pleaded for her clemency, arguing that she was reformed. However, Texas authorities refused to overturn her sentence. On February 3, 1998, at the age of 38, Carla Faye Tucker was executed by lethal injection at the Huntsville unit in Texas. She was the first woman executed in the US in nearly 15 years. Those who witnessed her final moments described her as peaceful and composed. Tucker declined a special last meal, choosing to fast instead. Her final words reflected her faith. "I'm going to be face to face with Jesus now. I love you all very much. I will see you all when you get there." Tucker's case drew worldwide attention because of her transformation, but redemption was never an option for the woman in our next case. She didn't just kill, she turned murder into a twisted game, targeting men in cold blood. Gishonta Judius Judy Buenoano. Long before her arrest, Judius Judy Buenoano was already known as the Black Widow due to a pattern of suspicious deaths surrounding her. At 28 years old, she poisoned her husband James Goodyear in 1971 with arsenic, slowly weakening him until he died. She later killed her disabled son, Michael Goodyear, in 1980 by pushing him out of a canoe and letting him drown. Investigators later tied her to the deaths of multiple men, including a fiancé and a former boyfriend, all of whom had taken out life insurance policies with her as the beneficiary. Buenoano was arrested in 1983 after a failed attempt to murder her new fiancé, John Gentry, with a car bomb. As authorities investigated her, they uncovered the shocking pattern of her past crimes. She was convicted of her husband's murder in 1984 and sentenced to death. She later received an additional life sentence for her son's drowning. Despite multiple appeals, her death sentence remained intact. On March 30th, 1998, at the age of 54, Buenoano was executed in the electric chair at Florida State Prison. She became the first woman executed in Florida since 1848. Witnesses said she showed no remorse as she was strapped into the chair. She declined a special last meal, opting for a cup of hot tea instead. When asked for final words, she simply said, "No, sir." Buenoano manipulated, poisoned, and killed without hesitation, leaving a trail of bodies behind her. But unlike her, our next case wasn't about calculated murder for financial gain. It was a senseless, rage-fueled slaughter that ended in the electric chair. 9. Suzanne Margaret Basso. In 1998, 44-year-old Suzanne Basso masterminded one of the most brutal murders in Texas history. She lured 59-year-old Louis Buddy Musso, a mentally disabled man, into a fake romantic relationship, convincing him to move to Texas with promises of love and care. Instead, she and her accomplices subjected Musso to days of horrific torture, beating him with belts, scalding him in hot water, and forcing him to sleep on a urine-soaked floor. When he finally died from his injuries, Basso dumped his body near a roadside and attempted to cash in on his life insurance. Basso was quickly arrested and charged with capital murder. Prosecutors presented overwhelming evidence, including witness testimonies from her accomplices. Her trial exposed her as the ringleader of a sadistic plot fueled by greed. In 1999, she was sentenced to death, making her one of the few women on Texas death row. Despite multiple appeals arguing that she was mentally unfit for execution, the courts upheld her sentence. On February 5, 2014, at the age of 59, Suzanne Basso was executed by lethal injection at the Huntsville unit in Texas. Unlike some inmates who spent their final moments expressing remorse or love for their families, Basso remained silent and refused to make eye contact with anyone. Texas had abolished special last meals for death row inmates by the time of Basso's execution, so she was given the standard prison meal. When asked for her final words, she had nothing to say. Basso's case was defined by cruelty and deception. But what happens when the murderer wears a badge? Our next case tells the chilling story of a young police officer who used her authority to commit a crime so cold-blooded that it sent shockwaves through her own department. 8. Antoinette Frank. Antoinette Frank was a 23-year-old New Orleans police officer when she committed one of the most shocking crimes in law enforcement history. On March 4th, 1995, Frank and her teenage accomplice, Rogers Lacaze, entered a Vietnamese restaurant where she worked off duty as a security guard. She knew the owners well, but that didn't stop her from executing 3 people in cold blood: police officer Ronald Williams and siblings Ha and Quang Vu. Frank shot Williams multiple times, even as he begged for his life, before turning the gun on the Vu family to steal cash from the restaurant's safe. Frank was arrested the same night, and investigators were stunned to learn that she was already suspected of stealing police weapons and using her badge for criminal activities. The evidence against her was overwhelming. Surveillance footage, eyewitnesses, and ballistic reports all pointed to her guilt. She was convicted of 3 counts of first-degree murder in 1995 and sentenced to death. As of now, Antoinette Frank remains on death row in Louisiana. She has exhausted nearly all her appeals, and although her execution has been delayed multiple times, she could still face lethal injection in the future. Since she has not yet been executed, there is no record of a last meal or final words. Frank was a police officer who betrayed the very badge meant to protect lives. But our next case involves a woman who manipulated others into carrying out a mass killing, making her one of the most notorious female criminals in modern history. 7. Teresa Lewis. On October 30th, 2002, 33-year-old Teresa Wilson Bean Lewis orchestrated the murders of her husband Julian Lewis and her stepson Charles Lewis in Virginia. She didn't pull the trigger herself. Instead, she seduced 2 younger men, Matthew Schallenberger and Rodney Fuller, convincing them to carry out the killings in exchange for cash from Julian's life insurance policy. On the night of the murder, as Julian and Charles slept, the two hitmen entered the home and shot them multiple times while Teresa waited in another room. When the job was done, she played the role of the grieving widow, calling 911 and pretending the family had been the victim of a break-in. It didn't take long for investigators to uncover the truth. Teresa had spent weeks plotting the murders, promising money and even sexual favours to her hired killers. Phone records and letters revealed her direct involvement, and both gunmen testified against her in court. While Schallenberger and Fuller received life sentences, Teresa, deemed the mastermind, was sentenced to death in 2003. Despite appeals arguing that she had a low IQ and was manipulated by her co-conspirators, her execution was set. On September 23, 2010, at the age of 41, Teresa Lewis was executed by lethal injection at the Greensville Correctional Center in Virginia. She became the first woman executed in the state in nearly a century. Witnesses described her as appearing peaceful as she lay strapped to the gurney. Lewis requested a last meal of fried chicken, peas with butter, apple pie, and Dr. Pepper. Her final words were directed at the victims' families. "I just want Kathy to know that I love her, and I'm very sorry." Teresa Lewis manipulated others to kill for her, but at least she admitted her guilt in the end. Our next case, however, involves a woman who swore she was innocent. Even as the execution needle entered her arm, 6. Wanda Jean Allen. On December 1st, 1988, 29-year-old Wanda Jean Allen shot and killed her girlfriend Gloria Leathers outside an Oklahoma City police station. The couple had a history of domestic violence, and that night, after a heated argument, Leathers tried to seek safety at the station. But before she could enter, Allen pulled out a gun and shot her in broad daylight. Shockingly, this wasn't the first time Allen had killed. She had previously served time for the 1981 shooting death of another woman, but had been released early. Allen was arrested immediately and charged with first-degree murder. Despite evidence that she had a history of violent behaviour, her defence argued that her low IQ and history of abuse should be taken into consideration. The jury disagreed, convicting her in 1989 and sentencing her to death. Appeals were filed, and civil rights activists, including Amnesty International, fought for clemency, citing racial bias and inadequate legal representation. However, the Oklahoma courts refused to overturn her sentence. On January 11, 2001, at the age of 41, Wanda Jean Allen was executed by lethal injection at the Oklahoma State Penitentiary. She became the first black woman to be executed in the US since 1954. Witnesses said she appeared calm but emotional as she faced her final moments. Allen declined a special last meal and ate the standard prison dinner. Her final words were simple and heartfelt. "Father, forgive them. They know not what they do." Allen's case stirred controversy, but her execution went ahead despite protests. The next woman on our list didn't have activists fighting for her because no one believed she deserved to be saved. Her crime was so brutal that even hardened detectives were left shaken. Cinquiem Kimberly McCarthy. On July 21, 1997, 36-year-old Kimberly McCarthy carried out a gruesome murder that shocked Texas. She targeted her 71-year-old neighbour, Dorothy Booth, a retired college professor. Posing as someone in need of help, McCarthy tricked Booth into letting her inside her home. Once inside, she stabbed Booth multiple times, beat her, and ultimately cut off her finger to steal her wedding ring. She then used Booth's credit cards to buy drugs and luxury items. McCarthy was arrested within days, as evidence quickly linked her to the crime. Investigators later found that she was also suspected in 2 other elderly murders, though she was never formally charged for those. At trial, the prosecution presented overwhelming DNA and forensic evidence. In 1998, she was convicted and sentenced to death. Her appeals were repeatedly denied, despite claims that racial bias played a role in her sentencing. On June 26, 2013, at the age of 52, Kimberly McCarthy was executed by lethal injection at the Huntsville unit in Texas. She was the 500th person executed in Texas since the reinstatement of the death penalty in 1976. Witnesses described her as composed but distant, as she entered the execution chamber. Texas had already banned special last meals for death row inmates by the time of McCarthy's execution, so she was given the standard prison meal. Her final words were directed toward the victim's family. "This is not a loss. This is a win. You know where I am going. I am going home to be with Jesus. Keep the faith. I love you all." McCarthy's crime was one of betrayal and greed, but our next case is something entirely different. This woman wasn't driven by money, she was driven by obsession, and her victim never saw it coming. 4. Lisa Montgomery. On December 16, 2004, 36-year-old Lisa Montgomery committed one of the most disturbing crimes in modern US history. Posing as a pregnant woman, she befriended 23-year-old Bobby Joe Stinnett online, who was 8 months pregnant at the time. Under the pretense of adopting a puppy, Montgomery travelled to Stinnett's home in Missouri, where she brutally strangled her to death. She then cut open Stinnett's abdomen with a kitchen knife and stole her unborn baby. Montgomery attempted to pass the child off as her own, but was caught the next day. The baby survived and was returned to her father. Montgomery was arrested and charged with federal capital murder. Her defense argued that she suffered from severe mental illness and years of sexual abuse, which contributed to her actions. However, the prosecution presented overwhelming evidence of premeditation, including internet searches on how to perform a C-section and how to fake pregnancy. She was convicted in 2007 and sentenced to death. Appeals and clemency requests, including from mental health advocates, were denied. On January 13, 2021, at the age of 52, Lisa Montgomery was executed by lethal injection at the Federal Correctional Complex in Terre Haute, Indiana. She became the first woman executed by the US federal government in 67 years. Witnesses described her as visibly anxious, with her final moments marked by deep breaths and trembling hands. Montgomery was served the standard prison meal before her execution. When asked for final words, she simply said, "No." Lisa Montgomery's crime was one of calculated horror, but at least her victim wasn't someone she was supposed to love. The next case takes us back to Texas, where a woman brutally murdered her own husband and thought she could get away with it. 3. Betty Lou Beets. Betty Lou Beets had a deadly pattern, one that left a trail of husbands buried in her backyard. In 1983, at the age of 46, Beets murdered her fifth husband, Jimmy Don Beets, in Henderson County, Texas. She shot him twice in the head, then buried his body beneath a wishing well in her yard. She reported him missing and staged an elaborate cover-up, even telling friends and family he had drowned while fishing. As authorities investigated, they discovered something even more shocking. Jimmy Don wasn't the only one. Beets had also murdered her fourth husband, Doyle Wayne Barker, in 1981, and buried him near the same well. She had attempted to kill other spouses in the past, but they had managed to escape. Her motive? Collecting life insurance money and retirement benefits. Beets was arrested in 1985 after her son, suspicious of his mother, tipped off police. With clear evidence, including buried bodies and testimonies from family members, she was convicted of capital murder in 1985. Beets denied her guilt, blaming others for the murders, but the jury sentenced her to death. Despite multiple appeals, all were denied. On February 24, 2000, at the age of 62, Betty Lou Beets was executed by lethal injection at the Huntsville unit in Texas. She became the second woman executed in Texas since the reinstatement of the death penalty. Witnesses reported that she showed no remorse as she was prepared for execution. Beets declined a special last meal and ate the standard prison dinner. Her final words were brief but defiant. "I don't want to make a statement." Beets treated marriage like a deadly game of survival, killing for money and power. But our next case is different. This woman didn't kill for greed, revenge, or even self-defense. She took a life for one reason only: pure, cold-blooded pleasure. 2nd Aileen Wuornos. Between 1989 and 1990, Aileen Wuornos, a 33-year-old former sex worker, went on a killing spree that left 7 men dead across Florida. Posing as a hitchhiker, she lured men into picking her up before robbing and shooting them at point-blank range. Wuornos claimed the murders were in self-defense, alleging that her victims attempted to assault her. However, investigators saw a different pattern. Each victim was shot multiple times, their bodies abandoned along rural roads, and their belongings taken. Wuornos was arrested in 1991 after one of her stolen cars was traced back to her. Her girlfriend, Tyria Moore, cooperated with the police, convincing Warnos to confess on tape. Charged with multiple counts of murder, Warnos was sentenced to death in 1992. Over the years, she went through several appeals, but she later dropped all legal efforts, insisting she wanted to die. On October 9, 2002, at the age of 46, Eileen Warnos was executed by lethal injection at Florida State Prison. Her erratic behaviour in the days leading up to her execution included bizarre rants about mind control and government conspiracies. Witnesses described her final moments as cold and detached. Warnos declined a special last meal and had only a cup of coffee. Her final words were unsettling. "I'd just like to say I'm sailing with the Rock and I'll be back, like Independence Day, with Jesus, big mothership and all. I'll be back." Warnos showed no remorse, embracing her execution with eerie final words. But our next case is the complete opposite. A woman who spent years on death row claiming she had changed, finding faith and redemption. Yet, in the end, it wasn't enough to save her. Apologies for the earlier repetition. To provide a unique case, here is one that hasn't been discussed yet. 1. Kelly Renee Gissendaner. In 1997, 28-year-old Kelly Renee Gissendaner orchestrated the murder of her husband Douglas Gissendaner in Gwinnett County, Georgia. She conspired with her lover Gregory Owen, convincing him to carry out the killing. On February 7, 1997, Owen ambushed Douglas, forced him into his own car, and drove him to a remote location where he stabbed him multiple times. Kelly arrived shortly after to ensure the act was complete. The motive was financial gain from life insurance and ownership of their house. Both Kelly and Owen were arrested and charged with murder. Owen accepted a plea deal, receiving a life sentence in exchange for testifying against Kelly. She was convicted of a malice murder in 1998 and sentenced to death. During her time on death row, Kelly underwent a significant transformation, embracing religion and mentoring fellow inmates. Despite appeals and clemency petitions highlighting her rehabilitation, the Georgia Board of Pardons and Paroles denied relief. On September 30, 2015, at the age of 47, Kelly Renee Gissendaner was executed by lethal injection at the Georgia Diagnostic and Classification Prison in Jackson. She was the first woman executed in Georgia in 70 years. Witnesses reported that she sang "Amazing Grace" and offered a prayer in her final moments. Gissendaner requested a last meal consisting of cheese dip with chips, Texas nachos, and a diet frosted lemonade. Her final words included an apology to Douglas's family. "I'm so sorry to you all. I love you all. I love you, and I am sorry."